And here we go, folks. Mr. V back again to complete what we started with Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492. We're going to get all the way up to and through the modern age, starting with JFK. Today, we're going to talk about modern U.S. history. We're going to talk about the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to talk about the Vietnam era. We're going to talk about the age of Watergate. And we're going to go through Reaganomics and the Clinton years, all the way up to the modern day. Let's get started. We talked about JFK's foreign policy in the early Cold War presentation, but just as a reminder, with JFK coming into the presidency, he was challenged pretty much immediately by Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. He had to deal with the Berlin Wall issue of 1961. He had to deal with Charles de Gaulle over in France, who basically was deciding that France needed to be taken seriously on the world stage again after their somewhat embarrassing performance during World War II. Now, of course, this idea of the French and other international countries really kind of shall we say, challenging the United States perspective that we were the superpower after World War II, led to a flexible response from the JFK administration. The idea that we would kind of take every situation at its standing as it was. Instead of trying to come up with a blanket policy towards every nation, we would almost kind of selectively decide how we were going to respond. Vietnam certainly tested that. How were we going to get involved? Were we going to get involved? JFK had to navigate that as well because they were going through a power vacuum ever since the abandonment of a colony under the French control in 1954. The United States got involved during the Eisenhower years, but only with military advisors. And JFK, while escalating it, doesn't quite get to the point of war. And of course, Cuba, as we talked about, with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which was a complete black eye on JFK's presidency, followed up with arguably his greatest triumph, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. This led to a push more for what is known as détente, where we were trying to ease tensions between the communist forces of whether it be Cuba, the Soviet Union, China, and the Western forces, being the United States and our NATO allies. What had been called brinkmanship during Eisenhower's term of office, where we were taking everything almost to the brink of war, we were trying to ease it during the 1960s, starting with JFK. The early civil rights movement started in the late 1940s, early 1950s, just after the conclusion of World War II. As returning servicemen and women came back to the United States from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, there were questions as to whether or not they fit into American society and whether or not the principles that they had fought for were actually going to be enforced on American soil. Leading up to the Korean conflict in the late 1940s, Harry S. Truman took the very controversial step of signing the executive order that desegregated the military. At the same time that was occurring, the Major League Baseball started to desegregate themselves with the inclusion of Jackie Robinson on the roster of the Brooklyn Dodgers. When Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947 and not only played well enough for the Brooklyn Dodgers to make the starting lineup, but actually win the Rookie of the Year award, it caused many people to start to realize that African Americans could not only fit in, but excel where white men had only been allowed before. The Supreme Court took the controversial step in 1954 of striking down the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896 in their decision of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. This desegregated the schools, and while in 1954 that was the national doctrine, it took a long time for many schools to even adopt it. For those of you that have watched movies like Remember the Titans, you'll notice that T.C. Williams High School was desegregating in 1970, and that was in Virginia. So it's not like this was an overnight success. And if you remember, during the Eisenhower administration, it necessitated in 1957 the desegregation of Little Rock Public Schools and Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, with the Little Rock Nine, which again necessitated Eisenhower placing National Guardsmen down in Little Rock to forcefully desegregate the public schools. Spilling over in 1955 was Rosa Parks, pictured here, seated at the front of the bus, refusing to give up her seat to a white man. She was arrested, which then allowed for what eventually became known as the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, when African Americans started to rebel against their treatment on public busing and started to demand that they would receive equal treatment under the law in not just public places, but also private places as well. Of course, the civil rights movement of the 1950s laid the groundwork for the strides that were made during the 1960s. The Montgomery bus boycott, of course, made Martin Luther King Jr. a household name. This small-town preacher from Alabama rose to fame through the Montgomery bus boycott and his continued nonviolent protest against segregation and his push for civil rights for African Americans. Now, of course, it helped that Eisenhower was open to some change, but it wasn't really till JFK took over in the 1960s that the federal government seemingly was much more open towards change and, more importantly, intervention in the states that refused to desegregate their public spaces, their schools, and their bus companies, if you will. And of course, this is where you start to see examples of blacks and whites working together to try and break down those barriers with the Freedom Riders. Now, of course, the Freedom Riders are always depicted as, oh, they're just on a bus, they're traveling together. This was a very dangerous thing, as those buses were attacked, and many of the people on board were taken off and beaten by white supremacists or states' riders, and many times they were one and the same, for their actions against the government. It didn't help either that they were forcefully desegregating some of the college campuses. The University of Mississippi was forcefully desegregated when James Meredith was admitted as the first African American student on that campus. They also had, a few months later, the forced desegregation of the University of Alabama. And if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, that's in one of the first scenes of Forrest Gump. There is also violence on the streets of Birmingham when Bull Connor, the police chief, decides to enforce the law, if you will, his version of the law, against protesters by using police dogs, by using fire hoses, and this was broadcast on television into the living rooms of people all across the country. And the things that they saw on the TV appalled them and made them realize that the fight for civil rights was no longer just a black and white argument. It was an argument for civil rights on all accounts. And that brought a number of people in the North to the South to help out, including, believe it or not, Bernie Sanders. You can look up pictures of Bernie Sanders sitting with MLK and other African American leaders of the time period. So it wasn't just a black versus white scenario. This was right versus wrong, if you will, when it came to civil rights. Kennedy's reaction was to listen, something that many presidents had not done up until that point on the subject of civil rights. And the collaboration between himself and MLK pushed for furtherance of these civil rights ideas, and more importantly, it pushed them into law. The March on Washington was the crowning achievement of Martin Luther King Jr. of pushing for civil rights legislation, as thousands, hundreds of thousands of African Americans descended upon the nation's capital with white allies and others to push for civil rights, not just for themselves, but for all. And of course, that is where MLK gives his famous I Have a Dream speech. It was not all good things in the early 1960s, though, because a civil rights leader by the name of Medgar Evers is gunned down in Mississippi, and it took 30 plus years for his assassin to be brought to justice, because the reality was, as much as civil rights were moving in the right direction, that trend was not fast enough for justice for Medgar Evers during the 1960s.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you.
As I spoke about in the previous lecture, JFK's assassination was a huge shock to the nation. Whether you be black, white, red, or brown, it was a loss of innocence and a loss of the youth movement, if you will. JFK's assassination brought LBJ into the White House. LBJ was an older gentleman, obviously, a long-serving senator and House member from the state of Texas. So being an older gentleman from Texas, the South, if you will, did not inspire confidence that this man would be the one to carry the civil rights legislation across the finish line, so to speak. LBJ did something different, though. He vowed that the rest of that term was not his term, it was JFK's, and that he would see through to finality the dreams and visions of JFK and the new frontier. LBJ definitely was not a JFK. He was definitely not a youthful guy who pushed for the ideals that JFK and by extension his brother Robert F. Kennedy were pushing for, but he did adapt, and that was something that LBJ earned a lot of kudos for from historians and political scientists alike, in his vision that he would push for these ideals to become reality. In the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it pushed to end workplace discrimination, which not only helped out African Americans, but women, Latinos, and other minority groups to get a fair shake within the workplace, and when it came down to it, interviewing for jobs and getting equal pay and getting equal treatment under the law. He pushed for school integration. He threatened governors with the use of the National Guard, as Eisenhower and Kennedy had both done during their terms. He pushed for voting rights, which was eventually also put through in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And of course, gender equality was a part of this as well, as the modern day feminist movement started to take root, and people started to read books by Betty Friedan, or called The Feminine Mystique, or they started reading women's magazines by Gloria Steinem, things like Miss Magazine, that not only pushed for women to be successful outside the home as much as they were inside, but to also push for professional over personal gain, and not worrying about family as much as their own personal welfare, if you will, as a human being. And so LBJ's characteristics definitely took a back seat to his fight for idealism to reality. Now, the election of 1964 has to go down as one of the original crazy elections of the modern era. If you think the election campaign commercials of Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or anybody else from the modern era were rough, the 1964 campaign is off the charts. I challenge you to look at some of the television ads that were run during the 1964 election. Many of them are on YouTube. The Democrats renominated LBJ as their candidate after his success at taking over for JFK and pushing for JFK's vision, if you will, for America. He was challenged by the arch-conservative Barry Goldwater, who had become a standard bearer for the Republican Party and a return to conservative principles after what they deemed a crazy change from the 1950s society that was a little bit more clean-cut and conservative. In the campaign, LBJ and Barry Goldwater ran political ads that were so ridiculous where Goldwater would talk about if LBJ got elected, there would be violence in the streets of America. There would be all kinds of issues and social unrest and hunger and welfare everywhere and all this. Meanwhile, LBJ went after Goldwater for being too aggressive against the communists. And of course, pictured to the bottom left is a still from the most famous ad. It only ran once. It's called the Daisy ad, which was a TV ad of this little girl picking the petals off a flower, and then a nuclear bomb goes off. This was an ad that was run, again, at prime time, and everybody freaked out. Goldwater had to basically assure the nation that he did not want unconditional war against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But LBJ's television ad worked, and in the Electoral College, as you can see pictured there, it's a clean sweep. It's a landslide of LBJ voters as Goldwater wins his home state of Arizona and the South, but nowhere else. So LBJ ran a better campaign, but it does get ridiculous. There's even an ad LBJ ran of Ku Klux Klan members talking about how much Barry Goldwater needs to win this election. Basically saying a vote for Goldwater is a vote for the Klan. So again, if you want some entertainment this afternoon, go into YouTube and look up election ads from the Johnson-Goldwater campaign of 1964. It changed political campaigning for the modern era. Now, as I mentioned before, LBJ was a senator during the New Deal and FDR's presidency, and he was one of the most ardent supporters of the New Deal legislation in order to reform and recover from the Great Depression. LBJ as president, and especially coming in with a clear mandate over Goldwater in 1964, inspired him to push forward a new set of programs called the Great Society. The Great Society was basically the New Deal on steroids. The big four areas that he wanted to improve and bolster were education, medical care, immigration reform, and voting rights. These were four standard bearers that LBJ felt would help the economy and help the United States to prove their solid footing as a democratic and capitalist champion with a little bit of socialism mixed in. This inspired change within his own political party as people like Ronald Reagan, who was a lifelong Democrat, switched sides and started to promote people like Barry Goldwater. So it made a pretty clear shift in American politics over these programs. In the area that was most successful was medical care in his Medicare and Medicaid programs, which are still around today and taking money out of people's accounts. It basically is the disabled and elderly getting better health care, if you will, bolstered by the government. Think of universal health care if you're elderly. That's basically what these programs allowed for, and allowed LBJ to kind of further this idea that everybody needs to be taken care of within society. He also declared war on poverty. War on poverty sounds nice. It sounds like we're trying to get things done, but as with many government programs, it ran into problems of people poorly running it, using the money in the wrong areas, not distributing the goods and services where they needed the most. So it ended up being an abject failure in the 1960s, and really kind of overshadows the good that the Great Society was attempting to do. It opened the door, like I said, to plenty of criticism. Barry Goldwater certainly was going to crusade against it. And like I said, Ronald Reagan switches parties and pushes against this Great Society program because they feel that it is government overreach. And this is kind of the very early stages of the modern day fight over big versus small government, where Democrats currently tend to be in favor of big government programs. Think Bernie Sanders and his universal health care, or his forgiveness of college loans, or something where the government is paying for something to help even out the economic realities of the time. Meanwhile, on the opposite side, you would have people like Mitch McConnell saying that it's too much government overreach, that asking too much money out of the government. And of course, we'll talk about it later, the Tea Party movement in the Republicans, this idea that we're not paying for these things, we're borrowing money, we're growing the government, we're going too far with these programs. This is all where this started from. Now, of course, the Great Society did have some accomplishments, but like I said, overall, it was overshadowed by a number of different governmental problems and poor money management, if you will. But in reality, the main thing that overshadowed it was Vietnam. Vietnam had become a problem during the 1950s when the French had abandoned the Southeast Asian region and their colonies there from imperialism. This was in response to their weakened standing after World War II, and when the French left, it left a power vacuum there that was immediately taken over by Ho Chi Minh and his followers, who were proposing a communist regime in Vietnam. Now, of course, this was in violation of the containment policy set forward by Truman and followed up by Eisenhower. So we did get involved in the late 1950s by sending military advisors and military aid to the South Vietnamese. And this eventually escalated during the 1960s into an absolute and total struggle, not just for Vietnam, but against any communist influence in Asia. Now, of course, the supporters of this move to escalate Vietnam were this idea of you love it or leave it mentality, America, love it or leave it mentality, where if you didn't follow the governmental policies, then you weren't a true American patriot. The opposition, of course, was trying to teach that opposition to war was guaranteed by the Constitution, and certainly their right to speak out against it was not un-American. So, of course, the Teach-In movement was this idea of trying to spread the same message, if you will, of anti-violence, anti-war, while still promoting American ideals. Now, of course, they also really didn't like Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense and had been pushing this policy. So he became kind of the poster child, or at least somebody that they could beat up over this. And, of course, this gained even more traction in January of 1968, when the American government had been saying, hey, we've got to step up in Vietnam, we are definitely winning this war. But the Tet Offensive in January of 68 basically made it very obvious that that was not happening, and we could see it on television, and that television war mentality led to even more anti-war rhetoric. Also overshadowing the Great Society programs would be the continued struggle over civil rights during the 1960s. Of course, one of the main things that they were pushing for was voting rights. The 24th Amendment outlawed the usage of poll taxes when it came to voting. This was considered a hindrance to a fundamental right of all Americans, and so therefore anything that Jim Crow laws had used to try and prevent voting from the African American community, whether it be literacy tests, whether it be taxing people for the right to vote, those were all outlawed under the 24th Amendment, striking down a number of hindrances and allowing for an increase in African American voting. Now, voter registration was the obvious follow-up, but of course, groups in the South, whether it be white nationalists, whether it be the Ku Klux Klan, you name it, started to push back, trying to hinder the registration of African American voters. This led to the Selma campaign, in which African American civil rights leaders marched on Selma, trying to force the idea that they had the fundamental right to get registered to vote and be allowed to participate in democracy. Now, of course, the Selma campaign ended up in a boatload of violence from whites who just refused to give up the position that they had been using for years, that Jim Crow laws had somehow been legal, and they were going against the federal government's campaign here. Now, of course, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 also led to the outlawing of all these practices and tried to secure voting rights for not just African Americans, but everyone who legally under the 14th Amendment had the right to vote under their citizenship. But this was a back and forth struggle and led to a number of people saying, why are we waiting? Why is Martin Luther King Jr. and his message the only way? This inspired what became better known as the Black Power movement during the 1960s. Whether it be rioting in Watts just outside of LA, or whether it be stronger police resistance, resistance to the police force in the South or the Midwest, or even big cities in the East, there were leaders that were willing to come to the aid, whether it be Malcolm X, pictured to the top right, the Black Panthers, which grew as a movement during the 1960s, and Stokely Carmichael to the bottom right, who basically said this very peaceful march is not working. This civil disobedience where we, kind of protest for our rights, it's not working. It's not going fast enough. And while many of these people, especially Malcolm X, are misinterpreted as being violent in their nature, what they really were was tired of being kicked around. They were tired of every time the government saying they had a right, the people of the South or police forces or elected officials from those states saying that they did not. They wanted consistency and they wanted their rights right now. So whether it be that people thought they were violent, in reality they were just more forceful in their need for these rights and for the consistency from the government.
1, 2, 3.
With the backdrop of all of the civil rights and Vietnam and all the political upheaval of the 1960s, it came to a head in 1968's presidential election. The Democratic nomination all of a sudden went up for grabs when, surprisingly, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was eligible to run for another term, decided that he would not run for re-election in '68. That immediately caused a power vacuum where an anti-war activist by the name of Eugene McCarthy, who was a senator from Oregon, basically started the push for a withdrawal from Vietnam within the Democratic Party. Now, since the Democrats under LBJ had been escalating the war, this fractured the party, and it definitely made it a tough party when it came to age. Young people followed McCarthy, very similar to the way young people were following Bernie Sanders in 2016 and in 2020. Eugene McCarthy seemed to be the only voice speaking out for an anti-war plank to the Democratic Party. Robert F. Kennedy jumped into the fray in 1968 and was seemingly on the verge of tying the party together, getting some of those young people that wanted an anti-war plank and getting some of the older voters who had voted for his brother. But Robert F. Kennedy was gunned down after the California primary by a crazed individual by the name of Sirhan Sirhan, who was basically protesting Lord knows what. Most likely it had something to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but we're still not quite sure. Either way, tragedy struck the Kennedy family again as Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. Now, of course, when that happens, another power vacuum within the Democratic Party forms, and the Vice President Hubert Humphrey steps in to secure the nomination, albeit controversially, and it basically causes the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968 to be complete and total craziness and chaos. And when protesters clash with police, you've got on one side of the frame Hubert Humphrey accepting the nomination for the Democratic Party, but at the same time seeing clashes between protesters and police in the streets where they're pepper spraying people, they're using rubber bullets, they're arresting people, throwing them in the back of meat wagons. I mean, it's absolute pandemonium in the streets of Chicago. Meanwhile, the Republicans meet and nominate that old penny that shows up again, Richard Nixon. Nixon, who had basically said you don't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore after he lost the California governorships race a few years prior, comes back to secure the nomination on a law and order ticket along with the governor of Maryland, Spiro Agnew. Now, the effect of George Wallace on the presidential election in 1968 was fairly obvious. George Wallace was a Alabama governor, and Wallace, by the way, is the one pictured to the bottom left, Humphrey to the bottom right, Kennedy to the top right, and Nixon, of course, above the Nixon's the one. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama that Leonard Skinner is singing about in this song. Sweet Home Alabama actually has some Southern pride connotation, sprinkled with quite a bit of Jim Crow justice, if you will. If you remember in this, they do say Sweet Home Alabama, where the governor's true. That's who they're referring to. Wallace was the governor that said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, while accepting the governor's governorship. So do realize, and here it comes. So anytime you've ever sung this song, you're actually singing an ode to the Jim Crow South in a weird way. Now, Wallace, of course, secures votes in the South. He sways a number of Democrats away from the party, allowing for Nixon to win the presidential election in 1968 over Hubert Humphrey. And of course, that ends, if you will, the Democratic control of not just the presidency, but also Congress and congressional funding and programs as well. Now, of course, as you can see by the Electoral College map in 1968, the blue is Nixon. Nixon won the Midwest, he won the West, he won his home state of California, he wins Florida, and a sprinkling of states here and there, whereas Humphrey was able to secure the Northeast, he was able to secure Michigan, Minnesota, Washington. But that southern contingent right there that voted for Wallace from Georgia out to Louisiana and Arkansas were enough votes to sway the political election towards Nixon. And Nixon, of course, winning 301 Electoral College votes, won pretty much straight up over the other two, but it was the fact that there were Democrats voting for Wallace in those swing states that swung the election to Nixon. So in the 1960s, young people had noticed a distinct change from what they initially thought the decade was going to bring. These grown-up baby boomers who were hitting their teenage years and their 20s by the time of the 1960s were raised in a culture where there were assassinations, whether it be in 63 of JFK, 65 of Malcolm X, 68 of both MLK and RFK. These assassinations were occurring with such a frequency that there were a number of people that thought if you were a social changer or a political activist, that you didn't die of old age, that you were going to be assassinated. And this was a crazy, crazy time period to be alive for many of these young people. They started what is known as the counterculture. The counterculture, of course, just as it looks, anything that is cultural, they are running counter to it. So if the parents' generation wants them to do a certain thing or act a certain way, they're going to do the exact opposite. When young people were told that they were to raise a family and get married and follow the traditional family structure, that inspired what became known as the sexual revolution. Now, this, of course, does not mean that everybody is running out and having unbelievable amounts of sex. What this really was they were going to protest their parents' definition of love, marriage, and family. So you start seeing a number of people saying we're not going to get married because that is what the state wants us to do. We're going to have children outside of wedlock, which is against what their church teaches them or their parents' expectations. Bottom line is there are going to be strict, a revolution against the strict moral code of the 1950s, that button-up culture where everything had to be black and white. The sexual revolution of the 60s is finding that gray area, if you will. There's a drug culture that comes in. Now, this does not mean that everybody in the counterculture is going out and getting high, but there are some people like Dr. Timothy Leary that are promoting, mind-altering drugs like LSD and other narcotics. Now, of course, in retrospect, we look at that and see it's completely dangerous, but young people at the time really said if reality's so nuts, getting away from it for a time and a spell through mind-altering hallucinogenics and things might actually be beneficial, and we'll see things from a different angle. This, of course, is ridiculous, but the time period's so crazy they thought that anything that alternative to that couldn't be bad. Now, of course, all of this culminated with the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969. Countless numbers of bands and performers like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, who's pictured here, attend the Woodstock Music Festival in Bethel, New York, as a protest not just of Vietnam, but of the cultural values and the political realities of the time. It became kind of a symbol of the young people's aversion towards the status quo. Now, of course, the struggle for civil rights in the 1960s was not just a black-white issue. It also contained a struggle between male versus female, where the feminist movement of the modern era starts to be born and pushed for. This starts with writers like Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, and Gloria Steinem, who started magazines such as Miss Magazine, which not only promoted feminist issues, but also answers towards the problems that women faced in the workplace. Now, keep in mind, and I stress this wholeheartedly, women had the right to vote from 1920, but these women were saying that is not enough. There were economic hindrances, in case you've never heard of the glass ceiling effect, where women can see the job they want, but because of economic realities, because of absence of educational opportunities, they are prevented from getting those jobs. Now, of course, Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem are going to be pushing for these changes during the 1960s. And sometimes you have some strange protests that come out of it. They did protest Miss America during that time period. They had bra burnings. They did things that got in the news to promote the idea that women should not be housewives and they shouldn't be put on a pedestal to be looked at and oogled and ogled, that they should be taken seriously and given every economic and educational opportunity. During this time period, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, was founded to try and promote not just the Native American issues of the time period, but also to promote the idea that Native Americans should get their land returned to them from bad treaties and forced migrations back during the late 1800s. They took over the island of Alcatraz, which is, of course, a prison, but now is a federal park. And since it's federal land, they took over the Alcatraz prison complex in protest, taking federal land away from the government, if you will. And of course, they went after Wounded Knee, which had become also a federally mandated and protected park. And of course, the UFW, the United Farm Workers under Cesar Chavez, who fought for the rights of migrant workers during the time period, and especially people that were crossing the border, which of course has implications today. Believe it or not, this is a campaign song from the Richard Nixon campaign that basically pushed for a re-election in 1972 of Nixon. Now, of course, Nixon in 1972 was very popular as a president. His domestic policies had pushed the economy, had basically smoothed out some of the problems with the Democrats, and you started to see a real return to conservative principles that would have made people like Barry Goldwater very happy, and of course Ronald Reagan as well. Now, of course, in the area of foreign policy, that's really where Nixon hit his stride, because he followed the policies of Henry Kissinger, who was pushing for détente. He was pushing for a lessening of tensions between China and the United States, and between especially the Soviet Union and the United States. He opened up China by visiting China, recognizing the government, and even actually meeting with Mao and some of the Communist Party leaders. And of course, in the Soviet Union, he met with Brezhnev and basically worked towards a lessening of nuclear arsenals and kind of more of a peace initiative. And he even pushed for an end to the Vietnam conflict by trying Vietnamization, which was the replacement of American soldiers and American military personnel with South Vietnamese soldiers, basically taking the mindset that if you want your country, you have to fight for it yourself. Now, of course, this made him exceptionally popular, and he won overwhelmingly in 1972 the presidency, and not because of this song, I can promise you that. The Nixon presidency was on a high note in 1972 with his re-election, and he was looking forward to another solid 4 years in the White House. However, in June of 1972, there was a break-in at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The break-in was in the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and at the time didn't seem like such a big deal, as it was blamed on a group of rogue agents who were not seemingly associated with any sort of political candidate or, more importantly, party. However, over time, Nixon's CREEP, which stood for the Committee to Re-elect the President, which might be at least one of the most ironic acronyms for a political organization in American history, quite honestly, just don't use that term, but Nixon's CREEP was implicated over time by two reporters named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Through their exposés in the newspaper and utilizing a secret agent within the Nixon White House who was feeding them information, they managed to bring down the Nixon presidency by exposing the secret nature of not only the break-in and, more importantly, Nixon's knowledge and cover-up of it, but also the fact that Nixon had also done some other shady things within the White House in regards to Vietnam, in regards to a number of different government programs, and the White House tapes pretty much nailed Nixon to the wall as not only being somewhat, shall we say, creepy in his own right, but also being somebody that was really flirting with what was and what was not legal. Through Senate hearings, it became very clear that Nixon not only would be impeached, but that the Republicans would not have the votes to save his presidency, and that he would be the very first president to be impeached and convicted. As you know, we've had 3 presidents impeached. Those 3 presidents were Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and now Donald Trump. Nixon was not impeached because he resigned before any of that even started. Basically, the story goes that Barry Goldwater came to the White House and said, "Mr. President, not only will you be impeached, but I don't have the votes in the Senate to save you, as it's becoming very clear that you have broken the law." Nixon then chose in August of '74 to resign, and the picture there is him getting on Marine One to exit the White House as the very first and only president to ever resign from office, and let's be honest, in disgrace. So a once promising presidential career is brought down by the Watergate incident in 1974 at that point. Nixon leaving office left the Vice President, Gerald Ford, as the new President of the United States. This makes him the only president ever to be unelected to both the vice presidency and the presidency. If you remember, Nixon came into office with a guy named Spiro Agnew. But because of tax evasion problems and other issues, Agnew had already resigned himself. The minority leader in the Senate, Gerald Ford from Michigan, and, by the way, a graduate of the University of Michigan who played football there, so all you Ohio State fans, guess what? We've had a president. You have not. Nixon, leaving office, leaves Gerald Ford as president. Again, he had not been elected to either office. Ford, in his own right, seems like a very genuinely nice man. He seemingly wanted to do well, but he made some very critical and quite controversial decisions. First of all, he pardons Richard Nixon. By giving him a complete and total pardon, it means not only did he avoid impeachment, he also avoided any sort of jail time for any of the crimes that he may or may not have committed. Ford's response, or at least belief structure in that, is that the United States had gone through enough and that we needed to move on. And most historians have actually backed him up over time, realizing that was probably the correct decision. But at the time, in 1975, that was very, very controversial. Vietnam had also ended during that time period as the last helicopters had come out of Saigon, and Vietnam did fall. And he also was subject to the War Powers Act of 1973, which was passed to avoid things like Vietnam in the future, where the president kind of escalates a conflict without congressional notification. This basically says that the president has to tell Congress about any sort of military action and any commitment of troops. And once he commits troops, he's got 60 days with which to do something without congressional approval. Now, of course, if Congress approves it, then they stay. But if Congress says no, he's got to withdraw the troops. And of course, it didn't help during Ford's time in office that he had an inflation problem. And it seemingly was the only response that they published a bunch of buttons with WIN on it, which stood for Whip Inflation Now. One of the most sought after buttons ever created. WIN, or Whip Inflation Now, has become kind of the butt of jokes in regards to presidential handling of crises, especially economic. And of course, Ford had 2 assassination attempts within a week. Weirdly enough, both of them by women. The first one, he was getting into a limousine in San Francisco, and somebody took a shot at him from across the street. And then a week later, somebody tries to shoot him while he's walking through a park, if you will, and it was somebody who was a member of the Manson family. You can look it up. They're the most comical assassination attempts, even though they are serious as well. Poor Gerald Ford just can't cut a break. Gerald Ford lost re-election in 1976 to a political outsider, a governor of Georgia by the name of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter ran as an outside the Beltway, as it was known, candidate from a southern state that had seen some economic growth during times of economic instability. And when he won the 1976 election, it was on this mentality that they were going to go back to a normal state of affairs and get away from the Nixon taint of Washington, D.C. In reality, Carter had kind of a mismatch of a presidential administration. He did have a high point in the Camp David Accords, where he got the leaders of Egypt, a man by the name of Anwar Sadat, and Israel, Menachem Begin, to sit down at Camp David, the presidential retreat, and hammer out a peace agreement that has stood to this day, bringing an end to constant warfare between Egypt and Israel. This was the first agreement between a Arab state and Israel since Israel had been formed in the late 1940s. That was a high point. Nobel Prizes were handed out. Unfortunately, Anwar Sadat was assassinated for his attempt to make peace with the Jewish state of Israel. So it wasn't all good. In reality, though, Carter's main triumph of foreign policy was overshadowed by an Iranian hostage crisis where the Iranian people stormed our embassy and took prisoners and kept them as hostage, and everything that Carter seemed to do to try and quell this crisis seemingly blew up in his face. An oil embargo from the OPEC nations, which was the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which made gas prices and, more importantly, the supply of gas very, very expensive and scarce. And he followed it up with a speech that was labeled the Crisis of Confidence, or the Malaise speech, where basically he, for whatever reason, admitted that every American out there felt like they were better off 4 years ago than they were now, and that things aren't going very well. In reality, he was probably telling the truth. He was probably giving the American people the reality of the situation. But if we've learned anything, Americans don't really like reality, and they certainly don't want a Debbie Downer speech. So because of that, Jimmy Carter was a damaged good presidential candidate in 1980. In 1980, like I said, Jimmy Carter enters as damaged goods as a presidential candidate. He is countered by the Republicans and Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Now, during the 1980 Republican primary, George H.W. Bush, who was a career politician, somebody from Texas who had served in the House, served as the head of the CIA, had been a member of a number of different presidential cabinets and advisories. He runs against Ronald Reagan, who was seen as somewhat of a political outsider himself, as he had been the governor of California, but had never really been a D.C. type of person. Bush runs against him and calls a number of his programs crazy, including his Reaganomics, or trickle-down economics theory. He calls it voodoo economics during the presidential campaign. Now, such vehemence between two political candidates usually signals that when one of them gets the nomination, the other one will be dismissed. However, Reagan bucked the trend and said that he appreciated the fact that H.W. Bush was willing to go after him, and he made him his vice presidential candidate, which solidified the Republican base behind Reagan. By doing so, he overwhelms Jimmy Carter during the 1980 presidential election. The major issues, of course, were foreign policy and what they were going to do about the Cold War, along with what they were going to do about the economy of the United States, specifically in the area of oil and other natural resources. The result was an overwhelming victory of Ronald Reagan. As you can see, the Electoral College vote count was 489 to 49. An absolute trouncing of a presidential candidate who usually, Carter sitting as president should at least put up a better Electoral College vote count than that. But Reagan, again, had solidified the Reagan, what eventually was known as the Reagan Republicans, as well as a number of the moderates who normally would vote for the Democratic Party, but didn't have any sort of confidence in Jimmy Carter as a leader and as a president. The Reagan presidency brought together areas of the Republican Party that had not been unified for a very long time, even under Nixon's presidency. He called this the conservative coalition. Whether it be economic conservatives, whether it be evangelical Christians, whether it be just people that wanted a change back to nostalgic policies of the 1950s, Reagan managed to court all of those Republican voters and turn the Republicans into a much larger economic and political force during the 1980s. He also called it the moral majority. The moral majority was the idea that we had gotten away from our American values, that we had gotten away from our Judeo-Christian value set that had sustained us through our earliest years. Because of that, you started seeing people that would have been considered hippies back during the 1960s change their tune as they became 40 and 50 years old and become yuppies, as they were known. People that were a little bit more concerned about the economic realities and family values of the time. And they certainly bought into his Reaganomics, the idea that you cut the taxes of the people at the top, and their spending of their newfound money causes the economy to grow as the money trickles down through the economy, through their expenditures and their business ventures. Now, of course, all of this was bolstered by a White House that had solid advisors and people that were running those departments pretty solidly. And he also had his First Lady, Nancy Reagan. Nancy Reagan was his biggest cheerleader without question. She's the one pictured to the bottom left. Nancy Reagan started the Just Say No campaign because during the 1980s, we had a massive drug problem, especially in the inner city, with crack cocaine. By coming down hard on those crimes, they figured they would then come down hard on other crimes as well. So the idea was if you get people off the street that are doing drugs, that you will see other things like theft and murder go down as well. The Just Say No campaign, of course, has spawned a number of things. So if you ever had a DARE program when you were in elementary school, that's where it comes from. The Just Say No campaign was big on trying to prevent young people from turning to drugs and alcohol later on in life. Now, Reagan also furthered the rights of others and certainly furthered women's rights by his Supreme Court nomination of Sandra Day O'Connor, the very first female on the Supreme Court, pictured to the bottom right. And NASA, of course, also had a influx of females working not just in the controls, but also becoming astronauts. Sally Ride becomes the first female in space in the 1980s. on board of one of the space shuttles. Now, of course, the space shuttle from the 1980s that gets the most press was in 1986, when unfortunately the space shuttle Challenger exploded just 40 some odd seconds after takeoff. I remember this distinctly. I was in first grade when this happened. There was a teacher that was going to space, the very first civilian to ever go to space, a woman by the name of Christina McAuliffe. So, of course, our teachers wanted to watch this. This was a science day for us. And I remember watching this and immediately watching one of the teachers flip off the TV and ordering us all to go back to class. And we were all very confused as to what had happened. Reagan took to the airwaves that night and tried to give a speech to comfort the nation. And you be the judge, but I would say he did very well in showing empathy, and through his words helped us to get through the largest space disaster we had had up until that point. Reagan's presidency was not without controversy. The Iran-Contra affair of the 1980s basically was a controversy over the sale of United States-made weapons and missiles in order to fund covert activities in Central America. Now, the main person at the forefront of this is Oliver North, pictured to the top there. Oliver North, part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was implicated with a number of others for these illegal sales and funding of what became covert operations by the CIA, amongst others, basically attempting to overthrow governments in order to promote anti-communism, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Now, this is where Reagan gets the terminology of the Teflon presidency, because no matter what seems to occur, nothing ever seems to stick to him. He basically said he had no knowledge of this, that lower level people within the government and within the military were doing these activities, and that he really wasn't a part of it, and people believed him. This would not have occurred with people like Nixon. So, of course, it remains to history to judge what exactly happened with this, but that was really the darkest time of Reagan's presidency. Now, the high point of his presidency was fighting the Cold War. He seemed to do that in conjunction throughout the 1980s with the leader pictured to the bottom there, Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. They seemed to guide the Soviet Union towards a gradual dissolution and allowed for the Cold War to end without a massive amount of fighting and issues. So in the 1980s, we went from the evil empire, which was Ronald Reagan's own depiction of what the Soviet Union was, towards the falling of the Berlin Wall and the caving of the Soviet structure so much that the Soviet Union eventually dissolves. Now, it doesn't happen during Reagan's time period, but it does. He does get an innumerable amount of credit for this. Even if you go over to Berlin, there are all kinds of plaques everywhere, especially around where the Berlin Wall used to be, showing that, yes, Ronald Reagan had a huge step or a huge force in making that occur. And there's even a plaque where he gave the evil empire speech, reminding the people of Germany and the world that this can happen again, that communism can rise, authoritarianism can rise, and that people need to stand guard against it. So again, if you ask the Germans, they'd be very pro Ronald Reagan for his handling of the Cold War. George H.W. Bush took over after the election of 1988 and saw the tail end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall falls in November of 1989 and signals, in a weird way, the end of that 45-year struggle known as the Cold War. This is why if you look up old footage on YouTube, you will see people crying. I remember my mother crying while watching this footage. Now, of course, I didn't really understand it when I was 10 years old. But now that I look back on it, I can realize why it was such a big event. Now, while that was an amazing picture of what could happen when authoritarianism starts to crumble, an example of authoritarianism that was bolstered was during the Tiananmen Square issue in China, when students and young people started to protest for democratic rights within China, the government cracked down on them in Tiananmen Square, sending the military in. And of course, you can look this up too. Go ahead and look up on YouTube Tank Man. It's a young person who basically stands in front of a line of tanks, refusing to allow them to move. He eventually climbs on top of the tank and starts banging on the top of it, demanding to see the military officials that are in it. It's a very, very specifically, interesting event, if you will, where you have one man standing against the authoritarian regime of China and has become a symbol through artwork and print and whatever else of one person standing up against authoritarianism. Of course, George H.W. Bush doesn't quite respond to that the same way that Americans really want him to, and certainly not the way the leader of the West or democracy should, and so China kind of gets away with that one. Then there's Desert Storm. He gets us involved in Iraq for the first time. When we invade after Iraq invades our ally Kuwait over oil rights. And we've, of course, been in Iraq and more specifically the Persian Gulf ever since. And that happened in 1991. The downfall of George H.W. Bush's presidency was a recession that hit. After a pretty solid 1980s, the recession follows up and shows an economic slowdown during the tail end of his presidency, which is not good when you're running for re-election and the economy starts to falter.
If tomorrow all the things were gone, I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife. I thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away. Proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. From the lakes of Minnesota to the hills of Tennessee, across the plains of Texas, from sea to shining sea, from Detroit down to Houston and New York to LA, well, there's pride in every American heart, and it's time we stand and say today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
This faltering of the economy allowed in 1992 for a young governor from Arkansas named William Jefferson Clinton to become president of the United States. He was helped along with this by a third-party candidate who was also frustrated with the economic policies of George H.W. Bush by the name of H. Ross Perot. Perot was a businessman from Texas who basically argued that the government had overspent on most of their programs and needed to be kind of curtailed. He's really kind of a trailblazer when it came to the idea of economic and political reining in of spending, and kind of a precursor of what we would call now today the Tea Party movement. Now, Clinton gains from this by becoming a president, even though he never gets 50% of the vote. Doesn't matter, the Electoral College puts him in, and so Bill Clinton comes into office on a wave of support and certainly a populist mentality. He was definitely in the ballpark when it came to LBJ type thinking. He tries to provide for health care. In reality, it's kind of the precursor to what we now call the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. And weirdly enough, Hillary Clinton, the first lady under Bill Clinton, pictured there, becomes the person pushing for that within Congress. Hillary Clinton fails in this, but she does lay the groundwork for what eventually Obama would pick up and run with during his time in office. They pushed for a balanced budget during this time period, and for the first time in a long time, we had a budget surplus, which means we were actually slowing down the debt and actually, for the first time, not being in a deficit in a long time. Now, of course, not being in the Cold War helped, and some of the trade agreements did help, at least in the short term, like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which cut down on tariffs between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. This has been renegotiated under the Trump administration and certainly was a black eye for somebody like Hillary Clinton running for president in 2016, as in the long run, this did not turn out very well, especially for the Midwest and Great Lakes region, what is known as the Rust Belt. And post-Cold War, Clinton had to deal with Iraq and what to do because Saddam Hussein was still in charge. He had to deal with Kosovo, which was the final stages of the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, which had split into Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, of course, they were splintering off even further, and Clinton had to deal with that along with the United Nations. And we had our first bouts of terrorism, whether it be the domestic terrorism in Oklahoma City and the Oklahoma City bombing, or the bombing of our embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, or of course the very first appearance of Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network in the bombing of the World Trade Center. Bill Clinton also had to deal with domestic policy differences when it came to the Republican Party, which was bolstered under the leadership of Newt Gingrich, who became the Speaker of the House in the Republican Revolution of 1994. This midterm election led to a complete overhaul of Congress and the ascendancy of Newt Gingrich to the speakership. He pushed for what he called the Contract for America, or the Contract with America in 1994, which basically was trying to curtail a number of the Democratic policies of Clinton and certainly promoted the new conservative movement that claimed to be a return to Reaganomics and Reagan principles, but in reality was a new version of conservative economic and principled leadership, if you will. Now, Clinton also had to deal with being impeached. He was implicated in a number of different things. First of all, the Whitewater scandal, which was a land development deal down in Arkansas prior to him becoming president of the United States, which Congress allowed for the man pictured to the bottom right, Ken Starr, to start investigating as special counsel. This special counsel instead found that Clinton had done other things. And while he was never able to really pinpoint Clinton or his wife in Whitewater, Starr was able to present a report which showed that not only had Clinton had extramarital affairs, but more importantly had lied about them under oath. This is perjury, of course, and that would be an illegal activity. You cannot lie under oath. Clinton argued that this was not an offense that would prevent him from doing his job, and in the end, yes, he was impeached. He becomes the second president impeached, but he was not convicted by the Senate, and it was because most of the senators agreed, and it helped that he had the Democrats on his side, of course, but most of them agreed that while perjury is a bad thing, and it's certainly embarrassing to lie, especially about extramarital affairs while in the White House, it was not something that would have prevented him from doing his job in the long run. So Clinton got to keep his job. But, of course, as you've heard Nancy Pelosi say about Donald Trump, once you're impeached, you're always impeached. And certainly Newt Gingrich would point to that as well as one of his crowning achievements, is that he was able to impeach William Jefferson Clinton.
As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life.
Now, of course, Clinton's impeachment led directly into the 2000 election that pitted the Vice President Al Gore against the Texas Governor George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Now, in the 2000 election, it became very clear that Clinton's impeachment did hurt Al Gore. Al Gore was not exactly a very personable person. He was not exactly warm and fuzzy. He certainly was the anti-Clinton. But George W. Bush had a much better presence in the media, if nothing else. It came down to Florida in 2000. As you can see by the Electoral College map, George W. Bush managed to get the Solid South, as it's known, and the Bible Belt, while Gore managed to get the northeast of the United States as well as the West Coast. But it all came down to the 25 Electoral College votes in Florida, spaced by only a few hundred votes. When it came to some vote counts, it became very clear that Bush had won, but a very razor-thin margin. We didn't know on election night that George W. Bush was the president of the United States, which led to the famous Newsweek cover, "The winner is," with Gore pictured to the left and Bush pictured to the right. We weren't sure. It wasn't until mid-December that we officially made George W. Bush the president-elect, and he became the president of the United States, the 43rd president of the United States, in January of 2001. Now, George W. Bush, within the first few months of his presidency, was faced with the largest terrorist attack on U.S. soil in history. The 9/11 attacks occurred mainly because the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, funded and operated, led by Osama bin Laden, pictured to the left there, came up with a plan to destroy the American political, military, and economic centers using jumbo jets to get it done. Of course, they attacked the World Trade Center, which is right on Wall Street, the economic heart of the United States, the Pentagon, which is our military nerve center, and Flight 93, which crashed in Pennsylvania because the people on board took over the flight, was most likely destined to the heart of D.C., whether it be the White House or the Capitol building. They were attempting to go after the nerve center of the United States in all facets. The attack, of course, was on the early morning of September 11th and threw the United States into a complete and total chaos as to what was going on. The response was swift. George W. Bush went on TV, along with the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, who are pictured to the bottom there. They came out with a unified message of hope and resolve, and the effect of 9/11, of course, brought the United States together in response to this terrorist attack and allowed for a military incursion into both Afghanistan and later Iraq to go after the nerve centers of these terrorist networks. Now, of course, Afghanistan was definitely going after Al-Qaeda. Iraq has been very, very controversial as a decision ever since, as it was very tenuous to start with, and it has been shown that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction and was not funding directly towards the Al-Qaeda network. Still, both struggles were going after these terrorist cells and attempting to neutralize them with the same concept of containment that we had been using since the 1940s, that we fight them overseas so they don't come over here. The Bush administration also had tax cuts, very famously, and did manage to get reelected in 2004 with still a razor slim margin over John Kerry, but continued forward the policies of both the foreign policy of the war on terror and the response towards the economic issues of the time. Needless to say, George W. Bush did serve 2 terms, and in 2008 was leaving office with a very famous election to follow. And of course, in 2008, the election between John McCain of Arizona, a Republican, and the Democrat Barack Obama of Illinois definitely was a difference maker when it came to presidential politics. For the first time ever, the main party's candidate was an African American. Barack Obama won the election fairly handily in 2008, and for the first time, the President of the United States was not a white Protestant. Instead, he was an African American Protestant, which I need to make clear, as there were some people out there that were making claims that he was secretly Muslim. And of course, this is why we don't talk about these presidencies in the context of right now. We have to wait for some time period for all the craziness to kind of melt away to where we can actually make a very solid case about whether or not a president is effective and what the truth is about their presidential administration. So if you've noticed, I've been very brief on Clinton, very brief on Bush. It's because history has yet to really judge them as presidents. And Obama, I'll be even briefer. His main accomplishment, of course, was the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare. Certainly gays got the right to marry during the Obama years, but he does have some foreign policy that may be questionable over time. And yes, he did win the Nobel Peace Prize, but there were conflicts during his time in office, and certainly there were a number of different questions as to whether or not he was handling the war on terror correctly, even though during his time in office he did manage to kill Osama bin Laden with the use of a SEAL Team 6. It's going to be interesting to see how history grades his presidency. Merely because, we're not sure how the Affordable Care Act will weather the time here. We're not sure how gay marriage will impact the United States, and we're certainly not sure about his foreign policy. So it's hard to kind of encapsulate this historically. The one thing we do know is that the election of Barack Obama did spark a change in presidential politics and American governance in general. Now, Donald Trump has used this song repeatedly, not just at the convention, but also throughout his presidential campaign in 2016. It's a Rolling Stones song entitled "You Can't Always Get What You Want." Now, that is questionable to use as a message as a candidate, but seemingly it worked. And in 2016, Trump managed to beat Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College. By doing so, he became the 45th president of the United States. Hillary Clinton may have won the popular vote, but again, as we've noticed in history, and it's happened 5 times, where the president has won the Electoral College but has not won the popular vote. Either way, Donald Trump became the president, and this kind of became a theme running through his campaign of he would do unorthodox things. He would do things that no presidential candidate had ever done before, and somehow it seemingly worked. So whether or not this is the new trend in presidential politics or just an aberration, history will tell us in the long run. Now, the Trump administration, again, I have to be brief because we're still in the midst of it. He did manage to get tax reform through the Congress, but he did not overturn Obamacare, which was one of the tenets of his initial run in 2016. By one vote, ironically, the vote of John McCain, who Barack Obama beat back in 2008. Trump certainly had a showdown with McCain over that, and McCain has since passed away. But Trump and McCain never really saw eye to eye, and it's interesting moving forward about what the direction of the Republican Party will be. Will they follow the footsteps of John McCain, or will they follow Donald Trump? Or will they take a third route moving forward? We're not sure. It'll be interesting to see. Now, in foreign policy, he has pretty much continued what his predecessors have done, but we'll see in the long run how it's going to work out, because he's managed to be a little bit more cozied up to people like Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and not cozied up in the fact that they're allies or anything, but he's been a little bit lighter on them when it comes to meeting with them and when it comes to negotiating with them. Again, we'll see how it works out. Now, I've mentioned before, he is the third president to be impeached. He was impeached for the Ukrainian kind of garbage that he got into. He was basically charged officially with using his office inappropriately in an election. Now, we'll see again if that has any implications on him in 2020 as we go through the election cycle. But as it stands right now, his biggest threat is the coronavirus, which is why I'm recording this in the first place, because I can't hold class, because, of course, the nation's schools are shut down for the most part because of this virus. And this outbreak and his handling of it will be questioned by historians, by political scientists for decades to come. Either way, we'll see how Trump is graded by history based upon the next few months and his reactions and responses towards this outside threat. Well, that's it, folks. You made it to the end. After a long year, you've managed to get from Columbus all the way up to and through Obama. While it's been an interesting year, to say the least, and certainly the last couple of weeks have been no common occurrence, of course, bottom line is you've managed to get from the beginning of our curriculum to the end. Where are we moving forward? Where are we going from here? Looking at the people pictured, the great Americans that have led up to our modern day, what would they think about where we are, who we are, what we've accomplished, and what are we going to do moving forward? Your generation takes over from here, folks. I've taught you what the previous generations have done, so you know what the basic framework and the principles are. It's your job to take it to the next level. It's your job to guide us and tell us what to do moving forward. And if you don't like what they've done in the past, it's your duty as Americans to change it in the future. That's it for me. I'm sorry for boring you. I'm sorry for all the lessons that I've had to go through, and I hope it hasn't been too much of a pain or a nuisance. But bottom line, if you have any questions, certainly reach out, ask, forward emails, come to office hours. But other than that, that is all I've got for you when it comes to the modern era. Have a good one.
Eventually be a memory of a time when I tried so hard.